Ever heard that saying, the one about don't mix business with pleasure? Well, get ready, because today we're diving headfirst into this whole idea of whether we should be keeping two huge E things separate, economics and politics.
Talk about a recipe for debate, right?
You got that right. And you know what got us thinking about all of this? A listener, thanks, redacted, sent in this really interesting clip, a lecture by economist Juan Ramon Rayo. And get this, he's making this whole case, entirely in Spanish, about separating these two powerful forces, economics and politics.
Exactamente. And we're here to unpack that for you.
We are indeed, but in English, of course.
Of course.
So just to give everyone a sense of where we're headed, we're working with this snippet of Radio's lecture. And let me tell you, the man does not shy away from complex ideas.
He really doesn't.
But before things get too complicated, let's be clear. Raoul's not saying get rid of government entirely or anything like that. It's a lot more, well, nuanced than that. He's basically pushing us to, really rethink the role of the state, especially when it comes to economics.
He calls it limiting state power.
Limiting state power, right. And what's interesting is that he argues that we've just kind of accepted the state's power, to step in and do its thing in society and the market. Like, we don't even question it.
And he says we should be questioning it. That's the whole point. Like, at what point did we all just agree to this?
Exactly. Like, hold on a minute. How did we get here? It's a bit of a head scratcher when you really think about it.
He uses this term, this phrase actually, hyperlegitimacy, to describe this kind of unquestioning acceptance of the state's power.
Hyperlegitimacy, it's kind of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. But it perfectly captures the idea that we've almost blindly accepted this authority without really scrutinizing it.
So let's break that down a bit. Why is it a problem if we just accept the state's authority without, questioning it a little? What's the big deal with this whole hyperlegitimacy thing?
Well, Rallo's argument is that when the state has this hyperlegitimacy, it can basically act without being held accountable.
Yeah.
It can step into markets, implement all these policies, even influence social structures, often without really thinking about what those actions might mean in the long run for everyone involved.
So it's like the state has this free pass to waltz in and make big decisions, even if those decisions could have unintended consequences down the road. Consequences for you, for me, for everyone, really.
Yeah. Exactly. And to really drive his point home, he uses this very interesting, even a little bit provocative example, voting.
Voting. Okay, now this is where I think things get really interesting because, most people would say voting is a good thing, right? Like, that's what we're supposed to do.
You think so? But Rallo, he throws out this really radical idea.
Yeah.
He says that sometimes, just sometimes, it might actually be more responsible to, get this, not vote.
Hold on. I think some of our listeners might be hitting the rewind button right about now. Tell me more about this whole don't vote idea. I'm hooked.
So, Rallo's argument here, it all comes down to the impact of our votes, right? He's saying that when we vote, we're not just making a decision for ourselves, but for everyone. And if we're not really informed about the issues, the details, the nuances, then are we really being ethical by voting? It's a deep question.
Right.
So it's like, are we really doing our civic duty if we're just blindly casting a vote without truly understanding the impact it might have?
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's almost like he's saying we have a responsibility to be informed before we even think about stepping into that voting booth.
Exactly. It's about informed action, or in some cases, maybe informed inaction is the better way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about this hyperlegitimacy thing and how it plays into the state's power and this really intriguing, even a bit radical idea about being super thoughtful, maybe even hesitant about voting. But how does all of this, how does it actually play out in the real world? What are some real life, tangible examples of this in action?
Oh, there are tons. Let's take something like, say, starting a business.
Right.
Regulations. Right. They're supposed to be a good thing, in theory, to protect consumers, to make sure everything's fair. But here's the thing. When the state has all this power, unchecked power, these regulations, they can get out of hand. Seriously,
Yeah.
They can become so much that they actually stifle innovation.
So instead of helping the little guy, all those regulations are actually making it harder for them to get started in the first place. It's like, you can have too much of a good thing.
Right. Think about it. Some aspiring entrepreneur, they're passionate. They've got this amazing idea for, I don't know, let's say a bakery, right? They make the best sourdough bread you've ever tasted, but then, bam, they hit a wall. A mountain of paperwork, permits, licensing requirements, you name it. It's overwhelming. They haven't even heated up the oven yet, and they're already drowning in bureaucracy. It's enough to make anyone give up.
Yeah, it's kind of disheartening to think about all that wasted potential,
Right.
all
Well,
because of red tape.
exactly. And then there's taxation. I mean, look, governments need money, right? We get that. They can't function without revenue. But when taxes are crazy high or just poorly designed, it can really discourage investment, and that hurts everyone. It can slow down the entire economy, and sometimes it even ends up disproportionately impacting certain groups more than others.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Like we're not saying no taxes ever, but maybe being a little more mindful about how those taxes are collected and used, making sure they're actually benefiting everyone, not just a select few, and that they're not stifling economic growth in the process.
100%. It's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between, having a functioning government that can provide essential services and allowing individuals and businesses the freedom to thrive and innovate. And that takes us right back to Rao's main argument about limiting state power. It's not about getting rid of government completely. It's about being more critical, more mindful of its role, thinking about its reach, and asking ourselves, is this really serving the best interests of everyone?
So, are we really sure that the current setup, the balance of power as it stands, is actually what's best for society as a whole? It's a really interesting question.
And those are the kinds of questions we should all be asking ourselves more often. Because this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. This stuff has real-world consequences for all of us. It's about our lives.
It's like we always just assume economics and politics go hand in hand, right? But Rallo's asking, what if we treated them like two totally different things? Like, what if they were completely separate?
Now, that is a question that really gets you thinking. It challenges the very way we structure things, doesn't it? I mean, what would a world even look like where those two weren't so intertwined?
Right. It's a tough one, like trying to separate flour and sugar after you've already baked them into a cake.
That's a great way to put it. And that's exactly why this whole discussion is so important. It forces us to confront some pretty fundamental assumptions about how the world works. I mean, we're so used to things being a certain way, we don't even stop to consider that maybe, just maybe, there are other ways of doing things.
So it's not about saying Rallo has all the answers, right? It's not even about whether separating economics and politics is actually possible. It's more about like expanding our thinking, considering
But
different perspectives.
exactly. It's about encouraging critical thinking. Rallo's ideas, whether you agree with them or not, they give us a starting point. They make us question the status quo. They push us to look at the systems we live in and ask, could this be better? Is there a different way?
And who knows, maybe by having these conversations, by really questioning what we believe, by being open to new ideas, maybe we can actually create a future where those systems, the ones we've always just accepted, maybe we can make them work better for everyone.
That's the hope, isn't it? That's what we're all striving for.
It definitely gives you something to think about. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into this whole world of economics and politics. A big thank you to Juan Ramon Rallo for getting our brains working overtime today.
His work is always thought-provoking.
It really is. And to our listeners, remember, it's not always about finding easy answers. Sometimes it's about asking the really tough questions, the ones that make you see things a little differently.
Could agree more.
So keep those conversations going, keep those minds open, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive. Until then, take care.